Good morning. I seem to be running on some other kind of time than on time this morning. Apologize for coming in just a moment late. It's good to see you this morning. I understand that our sister Martha Vickery was able to have surgery this past week on that hip. Trust that she is doing well and recuperating. Don't know of any other announcements for the moment. I've been talking about Bible questions that various ones have asked, and we had been talking last week of all things about the devil. What about the devil? Where did he come from? Why does he exist? Why does God allow him to exist? And just by way of review quickly, if you'll recall, no specific passage in the Bible speaks to his origin, not directly. Now, we can read passages about Satan or that would seem to relate to Satan. He seems to have, as we would describe it, fallen, you might say, in power, in position twice. There is a critical assumption that we have to make with respect to this. You look at the first image we have of him, which would be in Genesis chapter 3. He is not on the same page as God. He comes to the garden with a different agenda. We look at Job chapters 1 and 2, and we find him able to interact with God in the Father's presence, but nothing speaks to his origin directly. We look at passages like John chapter 1 and verse 3, speaking of the Word, the Son of God, everything made was created by him. And then we go over to Colossians chapter 1, we look at verse 16, and Paul echoes that thought, and so we would conclude then, Satan is a created being. And everything that God made is good. So at some point he seems to have turned away. But then we have the interesting statement by Jesus to his disciples when they are sent out to preach to the house of Israel, and they come back having been successful in that effort, having been enabled by him to heal the sick and cast out demons and so forth. And you look at Luke chapter 10 and verse 18, and Jesus' response to their excited report is, I beheld Satan fall like lightning from heaven, which we would assume, we read that as a statement about the power, the influence of Satan. And then we go on and look at Matthew chapter 12 and verse 29, and Jesus talks about plundering the strong man, the one who has influence or power, and talked about having plundered his house in that context. So, you may recall last week we noted that Satan is a real being. The word means adversary or accuser. And the devil is a description, not a proper name. Describes him as a slanderer. Think about this. In judgment, if he accuses you of sin and you have been redeemed, that accusation is slanderous because the sin has been forgiven. But we noted last week that his power is broken. He still retains some degree of influence in the present moment, only in as far as we allow him to. Only in as far as we allow him to influence us. So, moving along then, his work, and I put that word in quotes because I don't want it to appear that this is something that the Father assigned him. I don't want to leave that impression. But what he does in keeping with his character is to try to separate us from fellowship with the Father. In Genesis chapter 3, you look at the interview there between Satan and the woman, and Adam apparently standing there listening and looking on, doing nothing. What is the substance of the interview? Has God told you not to do this? Well, we can eat anything we want except this. Oh, you won't die if you eat that. You'll be like God. Sows doubt, and then tells an outright lie. There's the first lie in the Bible. You'll not die, you'll be like God. First and second lies. You go to John chapter 8, and about verse 44, what does Jesus say about Satan there? Well, he's a liar and the father of it. You look at 1 Peter chapter 5 and verse 8. Be sober, be vigilant, for your adversary, the devil, your adversary, Satan, the devil, the slanderer, walks about seeking whom he may devour, whom resist steadfast. Be consistent about resisting him, Peter goes on to say. Well, you look at 2 Corinthians 2, verse 11, 2 Timothy chapter 2 and verse 26. Paul says we're not ignorant of his devices there in 2 Corinthians. He does use things to mislead. He used a lie in the garden. He used deceit. He used ego. And his bag of tricks, if you will, has remained pretty consistent since then. And in 2 Timothy, Paul talks about the need to be delivered from the snares. What is a snare? A trap. The object, say again? A hindrance. The object of a snare is to do what? Anybody ever snare a rabbit or a squirrel or something? Okay. Now, it's one thing to go out with a pellet rifle or a .22 and shoot rabbits or squirrels. That's hunting. What's the difference between hunting and trapping or snaring? Do what? Well, now, a snare is intended to kill. A snare, you know, if you want to snare rabbits, typically a snare is a little loop of wire or cord that's going to grab it and yank it up and either break its neck or strangle it. And that sounds, to our very civilized society, oh, that sounds gross. But that's one way of feeding your family. A snare is something, you know, when you're hunting with a rifle, a pellet rifle, something like that, you are actively involved in the moment. But when you set a snare, what do? You walk away. You leave it. It's disguised. It's deliberately intended to catch your quarry unawares, to catch your quarry off guard. There's no warning. There's no indication this could be a dangerous situation. What do you do with a trap or a snare? How do you get the animal to come into it? Say again? You use a trick. You use a bait. Remember the old cartoons where Elmer Fudd goes and he puts a box up on a stick and puts a carrot under the box? What's the carrot? The carrot is the bait. And then when Bugs goes under the box, Elmer yanks the string on the stick and the box falls over. And of course, Elmer, being a not very good hunter and trapper usually misses entirely. Bugs is too quick for him. Can you tell that I watched a lot of Bugs Bunny when I was a kid? Regardless, we're not ignorant of his devices, and we can be delivered from the snares of the devil. You go on, and like I said in John chapter 8 and verse 44, he is not just a liar, but he's the father of lies. He propagates lying and deceit. Go on to 2 Corinthians chapter 4 and verse 4, and Paul says there that his objective is to blind the minds of as many as he can, blind the minds of the simple. The last time I was involved in an automobile accident, which was about 6 years ago, I saw it coming. I saw the car coming. I heard it coming. I saw the smoke boil off of the girl's tires as she tried to slow down and gain control in a turn, and knew immediately that she could not. And sure enough, she didn't, and she hit me and totaled my truck and several other vehicles as well. But I've had those moments and those experiences where I did not see it coming. It was a surprise. And one of the lessons that I had to learn when I bought the vehicle that I now drive, had to relearn really, because the one before it was the same type and had the same issue. There are blind spots, and you have to learn to look around those blind spots. The frame that holds the windshield in place, the frame is a lot bigger than in some vehicles. And at just the right angle, you can lose a whole 18-wheeler in that windshield frame. And if you pull out, he's bigger than you. Satan tries to blind the minds of the simple. He tries to catch those blind spots and stay in them so that we don't see him coming until, pow, he's hit us and we've fallen. So, he appeals to our own lusts. Here's one of the alternatively challenging and sort of morbidly fascinating things about him. You go to James chapter 1. Take your Bible and turn to James chapter 1 for a moment. And notice what James tells us there about temptation. Now, he prefaces his warning by saying, let no one make the excuse, basically, well, this is God doing this to me. You look at James chapter 1 and verse 13. Let no one say when he's tempted, I'm being tempted by God, for God cannot be tempted, nor does he tempt anyone. Pause there for just a moment, because that's a very, very interesting statement coming from James. Now, who's James? Seems to be the half-brother of Jesus, younger half-brother of Jesus. What is his background, philosophically, religiously? He's a Jew. When Job's friends, Bildad, Eliphaz, and Zophar, along with Elihu, the young man, came and sat silently with him in the midst of his troubles and then began to speak, what did they have to say to Job? You've lost your kids, you've lost your wealth, you've lost your servants, you've lost your herds, you've lost... God did this to you. You have sinned. Now, Job was not a Jew. He predates the Jews. But come over to John chapter 9, and we're introduced there to a man who was born blind, and the disciples ask Jesus a question about him. And what's the question? Who sinned to cause this man to be born blind? Was it him? Or was it something his parents did? There's an assumption there that in fact was very common in first century Jewish thinking and in the Old Testament era as well, farther back. And that is that if good things happen in your life, that's God blessing you. But if bad things happen in your life, that's God punishing you or challenging you. But James, with that background, says, don't say this is God doing this to you. He's learned a lesson, and it's an important one. How many times have you heard someone in the midst of some difficulty or challenge or hardship say, why did God do this to me? What makes you think it's God's doing? We want to blame somebody, but why blame God? We don't want to blame ourselves. There you go. We don't want to blame ourselves. Now, look at James chapter 1, 13, 14, and 15. Let no one say when he's tempted, I'm being tempted by God, for God cannot be tempted with evil. He himself tempts no one, but each person is tempted when he is what? Drawn away, lured away, and enticed by his own desire, his own lust. And lust, when it conceives, brings forth sin, and sin, when it is full grown, produces death. Satan appeals to our own lusts. That's the point that James makes here. Satan does not have power to control us, to force us. All he can do is appeal to our own desires. So, he deceives. What's the excuse that we use? Well, I can get away with it just this once. It's not that big a deal. It really won't matter. Ultimately, what are we saying to ourselves? God will not hold me accountable. God will turn a blind eye, or God won't see. It's interesting to go back into the Old Testament and see how many times the prophets challenged the children of Israel in their idolatry for telling themselves, God will not see this. What is there that God does not see? There is nothing that he does not see. God is omnipotent. That means he has all power. And omniscient, which means he knows everything there is to know. But he's also omnipresent. He's everywhere. The psalmist muses on that in the 139th Psalm. Where can I go to get away from God? If I go to the highest mountain, you're there. If I go to the deepest part of the ocean, you realize the deepest part of the ocean is about 10 miles deeper than Mount Everest is tall? If I go to the deepest part of the ocean, you're there. If I go into the grave, you're there. Where am I going to get away from God? You know, there's one place you can get away from God. Hell. And the only reason you can get away from God in hell is because that's the one place where His presence is not, where He chooses not to be. So he deceives. Satan deceives. He misleads. But what does James tell us in chapter 4? Resist the devil, and he'll flee from you. He can be resisted. It's up to us. So, God's perfect righteousness is actually spotlighted in our world. It's highlighted by the presence of evil. We tend to be oblivious to things that we take for granted until something comes along that shines a bright light on them. And in an ironic sort of way, evil shines a bright light on righteousness. Or perhaps we should turn it the other way around. Righteousness shines in the darkness of evil. What did Jesus say? Let your light so shine that men may see your good works and glorify your Father which is in heaven. And don't forget, as John the Apostle writes in 1 John 4 and verse 4, he who is in us is greater than he who is in the world. God is greater than Satan. They're not equals. They're not counterparts. God is greater. So, questions or thoughts? That's finishing up what we were almost done with last week. But now, another biblical question that several have asked over the years. If you take your Bible and turn to Genesis chapter 4. In Genesis chapter 4, you have the account of the first murder in human history. The record is of how the sons of Adam and Eve, Cain and Abel, come to present an offering to the Lord. Worship, it would seem. Cain appears to be a farmer, Abel a shepherd. We know the story, the backstory. God accepted Abel's offering. God did not accept Cain's offering. Cain was angry and murdered Abel. Verse 15 tells us, the Lord said to Cain, whoever kills Cain, vengeance shall be taken on him sevenfold. And the Lord set a mark on Cain, lest anyone finding him should kill him. So, the backstory, as we've just outlined it, the two brothers, worship, sacrifices, acceptance, and rejection. Verses 3 and 4. You look at verses 5 and 6 and 7. What does God say to Cain? Cain was angry that God had not accepted his offering. We could debate back and forth whether the problem was that it was a grain offering or instead of a blood offering, or it was Cain's attitude in offering it. We could debate back and forth about that. That's neither here nor there for our purposes. The fact is, God did not accept it. Cain grew angry. And what was God's response? Look at this dispassionately, objectively. Where's the problem, Cain? The problem is not with me. The problem is with you. Whether it's the substance of the offering or the attitude with which it's offered, the problem lies with you. If there's an issue here, sin is crouching at your door, and you have a responsibility to rule over it. And yet, even after he is told that, what happens? Go down to verses 8 through 15, but 8 through 12, the substance of the act. Cain goes out, speaks to Abel in the field, and then murders him. Takes his life. God subsequently confronts Cain. Where is your brother Abel? Am I my brother's keeper? It's not my day to watch him. Your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground. Here's your punishment. Here's the sentence in verses 11 and 12. And notice this. Take your Bible and let's read together there. Start at verse 8. Cain spoke to Abel his brother, and when they were in the field, Cain rose up against his brother Abel and killed him. Then the Lord said to Cain, where is Abel your brother? He said, I do not know. Am I my brother's keeper? The Lord said, what have you done? The voice of your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground. And now, here's the sentence, you are cursed from the ground, which has opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. When you work the ground, it shall no longer yield to you its strength. You shall be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth. There's the sentence. Here's the punishment. Keep that word in mind. Here's the punishment for Cain murdering Abel. He's cursed with respect to effective farming. The ground is not going to yield prosperously for you. You're effectively demoted from a resident of this area to a nomad, a wanderer, a Bedouin. You're going to wander from place to place. You're not going to have a stable home life. That's the sentence. And now at verses 13 and 14, look at Cain's response to the sentence. Cain's response, my punishment is greater than I can bear. Makes you wonder, what was Cain's home life like? What was his environment like prior to this terrible deed? He recognized on some level that this sentence was going to have a profound impact on him. My punishment is greater than I can bear. You have driven me away from the ground, and from your face I shall be hidden. I shall be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth, and whoever finds me will kill me. There's perhaps the greatest fear of this whole thing. Whoever finds me will kill me. Do what now? Why does he think? Okay. Why does Cain think somebody else will do to him what he's done to Abel? Well, it would be proportional, wouldn't it? Up to this point, though, there has been no law given regarding murder that we know of. So there's no statement of which we are aware that decrees proportionality for murder. Now here, Sally mentioned something that is a common thought, that this event somehow cursed the whole earth. But that's not what the passage actually says. It says, Cain, you are cursed from the ground. The effect is on Cain, not on the earth. So, why would Cain fear murder? Okay. On a practical level, Dale makes the point, perhaps he's recognizing at this point, if the ground doesn't bear for me, how am I going to, I'm going to starve unless I take from others, unless I steal, unless I turn to a life of violence and theft. But Okay. There's no, to our knowledge, there is no law given that says, that addresses the idea of strangers being protected or getting a fair hearing or anything of that sort. And certainly, because this wildly long period of time predates the giving of the law of Moses, there's no city of refuge to which he can flee. And for that matter, the city of refuge was intended for whom? Folks who had innocently caused death, and there's no innocence here. Although, how many deaths, physical deaths, let's qualify that, how many physical deaths have occurred in human history at this point? So far as we know, this is the first one. Cain, we would reasonably assume, has never seen human death. Now, he's seen animals sacrificed and eaten and so forth. God said, you do this. But he's never seen human death. So here is his brother's body, lifeless. And, okay. Okay. Yep. Okay. Okay. No law that prohibits murder, so far as we know. No legal obligation, no stated obligation that we're aware of, that we can read of, that requires Cain to love his brother. But ultimately, this traces back to what? Either the substance of Cain's offering and the attitude that would cause him to offer something unacceptable, or the attitude in which it's offered, because God did not accept it. It's not God's fault. It traces back to what Cain initially did. And it is the outgrowth of his anger and his frustration that God had not accepted it. But what had God said? Before this takes place, make it right. And that solves the problem. And instead of making it right, what did Cain do? He went out and talked with Abel. What did they talk about? I have no idea. Perhaps Abel said, well, you know what to do about this. You know, when you've done wrong and somebody points it out and then somebody else comes along and says, well, why don't you just do the right thing? Sometimes you don't react very well to that, do you? So, yeah, it makes you twice as mad sometimes. Even when you know it's the right thing. And so, whether it's in a fit of pique or premeditated, cold-blooded murder, Cain kills Abel. And there is no, they're not in paradise, but, yeah. Right. Yeah. Cain offered an offering of his own produce. Abel offered an offering of his flocks. And again, whether it's the substance or the attitude, for whatever reason, Cain's was not acceptable. And we could reasonably presume, based on the response, that he should have known that. Yes, ma'am, Miss Jones. Okay. Good question. When God says the ground will be cursed for you, or you are cursed from the ground, why couldn't he just go find a different job? Why couldn't he become a shepherd or a merchant or what have you? Well, think. Say again? Okay. There was the initial curse in the garden. You're going to have to work for your living when Adam and Eve had sinned. But now here specifically, Cain is told, this applies to you. Well, okay, I'll just go be a shepherd. You still need ground. I'll go be a merchant. What are you going to sell? I'll sell grain. Well, there's not going to be any for you to sell. I'll sell wool. The sheep are not going to prosper. I'll sell timber. The trees are not going to grow. Everything ultimately, in one sense, traces back to the ground, doesn't it? So we read something like this and we immediately start to look for alternatives. And then when we analyze, everyone comes back to the same root, doesn't it? Catherine? Okay. Okay, good question. Cain's worried about somebody else going to kill him. Well, who else is there? That may be a very good question. Do what? Okay. There is that idea that is present in the religious community that Cain and Abel were not the first children. The Bible does not express that specifically. However, let me make this observation. We don't know how much time has passed between chapter 3 and chapter 4. We don't know ultimately how many children Eve bore. We do know that that's a question for another time. We do know they lived extraordinarily long lives and seemingly were quite productive of children. And how fast can a population grow? Well, 70 people went into Egypt in Joseph's day. 430 years later, how many came out? Millions. It does not take long to reproduce a large number. Do what now? Okay, Cain's afraid of his own family. Everybody's related. Okay, very quickly, Mac. Yes. Okay, we get distracted by the details. That's a whole nother question. Okay. Okay. Point well taken. Let's not get bogged down in details that lead to other questions, but let's take a look at verse 15 as our time is escaping us. At verse 15, God says, "Not so." Now the fear is somebody will find me and kill me. Not so. If anyone kills Cain, vengeance shall be taken on him sevenfold, and the Lord put a mark. The ESV says the Lord put a mark on Cain, lest any who found him should attack him. Think about this. The mark, we think of that as what? We think of that as a sign of condemnation, a warning sign. In fact, it's an expression of God's mercy. It's protection for Cain so that no one will kill him. The idea of sevenfold vengeance, if anybody does kill him, God is assuring Cain, I will take complete, justified vengeance on him. In other words, the punishment will not be like yours where you killed Abel. I'm not going to allow you to be treated like you treated your brother. Anyone who killed Cain would be guilty of taking the law into his own hands because Cain is not under a death sentence from God. In fact, God specifically does not sentence Cain to die physically for this act. Now, he is under a death sentence because of sin. What is the mark? What is the sign? Well, it was meant to protect him, not to make him a target. If you look at the artwork of some of the old masters, you see some interesting interpretations of this passage in Middle Ages artwork. Now, the word mark there is the Hebrew word oath, which means a token or a signal, some kind of a sign. God gave him a sign. What was the sign? Well, there have been a whole lot of assertions throughout history. What expression have you seen or have you thought? I heard somebody say a mole or a birthmark a minute ago. The one who asked the question actually asked, was it something to do with becoming or being a giant? Well, some of the ideas that have been presented through the years, some of the ancient Jewish scholars claimed that he was paralyzed, that he became a paraplegic or a quadriplegic and became an object of pity. Others among the Jewish scholars said, no, he had a dog that accompanied him everywhere he went, which when you think about it from the Jewish point of view, what's the significance of that? Well, a dog is an unclean animal, and no Jew would keep a dog as a pet. They would want to drive it away, and yet here is this faithful companion, so to speak, that never leaves his side. One other idea that was common among some of the Jewish scholars was that no sword could hurt him, no stone could wound him. He was impervious to injury. In other words, try as anybody might, he couldn't be hurt. Come into the medieval period of the great masters, and oftentimes the depiction of Cain in artwork is that he has a horn growing out of his head. Like a cow's horn right out of his forehead. Talk about a unicorn. Here's the point. There are lots of ideas that have been advanced through the years that somehow would mark him out as an object of contempt, that would mark him out as an object, really that would mark him out seemingly almost as a target. And the fact of the matter is the Bible doesn't say what the sign was, what the mark was. It doesn't even say, now I realize the ESV says that God put a mark on him, but the Hebrew text doesn't say he did something physically to him. He says that he gave him this token, this sign, this mark. It may not have been anything physical at all on his body, but it was not a mark of condemnation per se. It was a mark of protection. Sister Early? There is that assertion on the part of some that it was skin tone. That may be why some of us are so pale. That saying, it's funny, ironic funny, not ha-ha funny. But it's ironic how often the difference in our skin tone comes up as a supposed explanation or excuse. Well, is this due to Cain, or is this due to Ham, or is this...